a few years ago and gave us a beautiful portrait. And he just really took a liking to Gene, and that certainly meant a lot to me. Chuck's businesses really were the community. Before we had community centers, the bars, the bathhouses, the motorcycle clubs, those were really our community centers. And in turn, Chuck helped create the neighborhoods that became our neighborhoods. The early days of River North were because of people like Chuck Renslow, Marge Summit, Rollick Leapeck, and Jim Flint, who created those early gay neighborhoods of businesses. I think today we forget, people, the bars are not as central to our community anymore, but they were the community back then. And to be bold and be a gay person owning a gay bar was actually not the norm. The Mafia owned a lot of our businesses. And in many ways, Renslow and Flint had to do business with the Mafia and the police, doing payoffs in order to do what they did. That it maybe still happens today, I don't know, but it took a lot of guts to try to do business as an openly gay business owner back then. I made a list. Owen Keene and I were just honored to write the biography of Chuck a few years ago. And we made a list of all the businesses that Chuck had. And I'm going to run through as many of them as I can really, really quickly. Renslow Photography, Century Studio, Chris Studio, Triumph Gin, the magazines Triumph Mars and Rawhide Mail, the Gold Coast, Steve's Health Club, the Shack, Big Basket, Renslow and Associates, the Barracks, Club Bath Chicago, Man's Country, the Machine Shop, the Toolbox, Grub Steak Restaurant, Sparrows, Zolar, Center Stage, International Mr. Leather, Gay Life, Bistro 2, Chicago Eagle, Costa de Oro, Bell Book and Candle and Cult Bookstore, Chicago Aquarium Company, and out of businesses including in New York, Kansas City, and Phoenix. He was a serial and parallel entrepreneur, bar none. Certainly a role model to me. But two of the most important things, I think, for our community that are everlasting and significant in the history of our movement are the International Mr. Leather, which of course has had local, national, and international importance. But it also, International Mr. Leather, the leather community in particular, because it was a small, tight, cohesive community, especially in the 1980s, it was devastated by the AIDS epidemic. As someone coming into the community in 1984, a lot of the early obituaries that we were writing were about Leathermen. And that community really shone strong against the AIDS epidemic early on in doing fundraisers, volunteering, showing up at the hospitals. And the leather community, as you know, was not always accepted really as part of the LGBT larger community. And yet I saw firsthand how important of that. I'm a pretty vanilla person. I couldn't even find white to wear tonight. I'm pretty basic. But I could see very early on that the leather community was an integral, important part of the community. And when people would tell us, they would say, oh, the leather queens and the drag queens are what we always see about the community. I'm like, you know what? That's the heart of the community. Those are the people who are out and bold and out front. The other major thing was Gay Life newspaper. Gay Life newspaper was founded in the mid-1970s. It wasn't the first gay newspaper in Chicago. In fact, that happened in 1924. Henry Gerber ran a couple issues and then got arrested. Then we had, of course, a lot of Chuck's early physique publications, and there were other newspapers that had been founded before Gay Life. But Grant Ford founded a Gay Life newspaper, and then later sold it to Chuck Renslow. When I grew up in Chicago, but when I came back to Chicago in 1984, graduated with a news editorial degree in journalism and wanted to be this openly gay journalist, my parents said, no, that's not going to happen. Not at the Tribune, where my dad worked, and not at the Defender, where my mother worked. But my mother heard about a job at a gay newspaper in Chicago that I didn't even know existed, and that was Gay Life. So I went to Gay Life and interviewed. Chuck had this very intimidating upstairs parlor where the meetings were that I rarely got invited up into, but I do remember it well. I think there was a lot of red up there. I was 21 years old, and he hired me on the spot. I could run the typesetting equipment, which was as big as a refrigerator. I could take photos and I could edit and write, but I was only 21 years old, and he entrusted me to be a reporter for his newspaper, and within a year, managing editor. And the community had a lot of problems at that point. Not that it doesn't have divisions now, but in the mid-1980s, there was a new upstart generation coming into its own, and certainly my age would have put me with them. But I didn't necessarily agree with a lot of the tactics, and I certainly didn't agree with the approach of kind of pushing aside the older generation. And so I worked at Gay Life with Chuck Renslow, and the AIDS epidemic, I think there were fewer than 100 cases when I started working there, and we wrote about it every single issue of the paper. And Chuck owned the bathhouse, which was literally right next door on one side, and the Gold Coast was on the other side, and he did not censor us. But the community felt the newspaper was compromised because Chuck had so much power, and people were not supporting Gay Life newspaper. So I made the difficult decision in 1985 to co-found Windy City Times. Chuck never held it against me, which says so much about his character, because really most people would never have anything to do with someone who would leave and start a competing industry, in the same industry. But we respected and loved each other so much that many, many years later, when I bought Windy City Times back from my co-founder, Chuck invested in the new Windy City Times. And then in 2011, he approached me and said, would I write his biography? And wow, I had to bring in Owen Keenan right away. And so many people had tried to write everything down about what Chuck had done and had not been successful, because it was unbelievably diverse and across so many different industries, from politics and newspapers and everything. But it was one of the biggest honors of my life, certainly, to take the legend of Chuck and decipher it for the next generation. We asked Chuck about some of those legends, and they fell apart, some of them, when we wrote them. But Chuck wanted as much honesty as we could truly find, because he didn't want it to only be the good. Because we're all mixed people, and Chuck wanted to make sure that there was both the hard stuff that he went through as well as all the good stuff that he did. And in the end, I think Chuck was so proud of his life finally being able to be, as he said, bound into a book instead of just bound in his life. The last thing I would say is that he, like a few of our pillars, like there's a few pillars I can name, and I certainly, as someone who came in at 21 in the 1980s, was so honored to be able to have met those people who had fought pre-Stonewall in Chicago. I bet you it was less than 50 people who used their own names fighting for our rights in those years. And some of them were still alive in the mid-1980s, and some of them have only recently passed away, like Bill Kelly, Marie Kuda, Rainey Hanover, and now Chuck Renslow. These were the pillars of our community. I think the most important thing he has done to make sure that that is not forgotten is building community through the Leather Archives. So I would encourage you tonight to make sure you give a contribution to that, and think about, especially if you're part of the leather community, leaving the Leather Archives in your will and in your annual giving, because that is the most important thing you can do for Chuck Renslow.